Have you ever felt like your whole worth kind of depended on a specific time, a single performance, or a certain score in a sport? Hi everyone, my name is Amanda Lee and I am a graduate student therapist currently taking the next steps to become a licensed mental health counselor. And welcome to the Reflection Room. So before I entered the mental health field, I was a competitive swimmer, and I like to say that was my job before this one, because it really did require a lot of training and work and time, and it was like a career for me for a while. And I did that for about 10 years. And today I want to talk about something that's really overlooked in sports in general, which is mental health. Mental health in sports is something that's kind of being talked about a little bit more now, but I definitely want to continue that conversation today. So to begin, before we kind of dive into that aspect of it, I'd like to provide some background about my experience as a competitive swimmer. Like I mentioned, I did it for 10 years and I started around 8 years old and went all the way until 18. So I started really young and I went through middle school and high school and pretty rigorous and elite training in high school. Now, training looked different throughout all those years, but I will say the most rigorous aspects of my training included 6 days a week of training, and that was like morning practices and afternoon practices as well. And it was pretty intense. So I learned a lot in that experience, and I have a lot of positive, and I also struggled a lot with my mental health during that time as well. And I feel like it's not talked about a lot when it comes to athletes, especially those who are children, performing at that elite level and what that can do mentally. There are so many benefits to being in sports when you're young, and I definitely loved all those benefits. I learned a lot about discipline and determination and what it takes to really achieve like a certain goal, and like what those small goals are to achieve those bigger goals. But at the same time, it can be really draining and hard for a young athlete. There's a lot of perfectionism, a lot of over performance where you're kind of pushing yourself through a lot of pain. And that's kind of typical within the sport world. Swimming, particularly in that nature of kind of like push through that pain. And I did grow up and I did have a lot of sport related injuries that I did push through, and I'm now feeling those effects for sure. But there's some positives and negatives as well, as like I've been talking about. Particularly what's amazing about sports is the community feeling that you can feel, especially as a kid, having that sense of connection with other people your age and other, children your age, and having those like really good role models like your coaches and things like that. There are a lot of positive aspects to sports, and this is in no way bashing sports. It's just kind of want to continue the conversation and bring it up a little bit more in terms of what mental health struggles, children especially who are performing at that level, might be experiencing. And this can be a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, because they're handling, school on top of developmental stages that they're going through, on top of a very competitive sport, which can really play around with feelings of self-worth and questions of like, am I good enough? And there's a lot of like, when you do grow up in a sport, you find your identity within that sport. And when you leave that sport, it can be really hard to figure out like, who am I besides this? And finding that identity kind of confusion, I've found, happens when you leave a sport, especially when you're in one younger. And I've talked to a lot of other, individuals who have done sports when they were younger and now are not doing sports. And there's a lot of like identity questions that arise, and that can really affect mental health too, especially for post-sports and post-athletic career. And so some other mental health struggles, like I mentioned earlier, perfectionism, anxiety, stress. Burnout is a huge one. I remember experiencing that a couple times throughout my swimming career, and it would kind of go through periods where sometimes I was doing really well and I would peak, and then sometimes I'd plateau out, and then sometimes I was really burnt out. And this, I noticed, usually correlated with like a certain developmental stage where maybe I was going through puberty or something like that, and was struggling with some other things. Body image is another huge mental health concern, especially for young women in the sport. Any kind of sport. I mean, I know that dancing can be really harsh in that area, gymnastics as well, and certainly swimming. And basically that body image isn't talked about a lot. There's just young girls, usually around teenager years, who are performing at such an intense and high level that they're not experiencing like normal development or, normal puberty. And once they walk away from the sport, then, that kind of shows up, like what a normal, like daily lifestyle kind of looks like, as opposed to the intense training. And a lot of women, and I know myself, have struggled with what it looks like after you leave and how to find a very accepting way of accepting your body, because it's never going to be at that peak level, because that's not a normal way to routinely live, if that makes sense. So I know that that's something that is not talked about a lot, and as someone who's experienced it herself and who has come out the other side of body acceptance and feels very good and safe in that sense now, I did struggle with it as a child and as a young adult and a young teen and things like that. And it was a really a big push to see where my body would perform to. And that is really what sports are, body performance. But it was finding out, back to that identity thing, finding out who I am beyond the sport, but also finding out what aspects of me are also important besides just what my body can do. And that is kind of what led me into the mental health field. There's multiple other reasons what led me here into this field, but I do feel like the struggles that I went through as a kid, and not just related to sports, but other things as well, mental health struggles, really shaped the way of where I am at now. I went through a lot of different things as a child, but specifically when we relate sports and how that affected where I'm at today, I really went through a journey when I left swimming. I was 18 years old when I left, and it just wasn't in the books for me to continue into college. Like I mentioned, I had some sports-related injuries, some surgeries, and because I was training at that intense level, my body was just not getting the recovery that it needed at that time. And that's perfectly fine. Just turn the page, a new chapter. And I really fell in love with education and learning and school, and really found my passion in what I could bring to the world besides just what my body could. And this is in no way bashing people that continue to do sports. I think that's amazing. I love sports. I definitely miss that aspect of my life, and I'll always be a swimmer in my heart. And I just want to encourage you to be very mindful about what mental health struggles you're struggling with and what's coming up for you while you're in the sport, because it can be really isolating and it can be really hard, and I deeply understand that. Another huge aspect of mental health related to sports is how harsh of a critic that we can be to ourselves as athletes, specifically about certain times or scores or how you performed. Just like they say that the artist is their worst critic, I believe that athletes are also their worst critic. I remember there were times where I would get out of the pool and be so upset, just so enraged about it, not doing a 1/10 of a second of the time that I wanted or something like that. And I would just be emotionally just completely distraught. And I remember people around me being like, that was such a good swim. My coaches would be like, you did great, you kept with pace. But that was something I struggled a lot with, and I feel like a lot of other athletes do too, where we have such high standards for ourselves, and the high standards can really wreak havoc on our mental health, and that's something that really deserves to be talked about. And I just want to offer you, if you are an athlete, the space to be like, it's okay. It's okay to not be at that level, and I know that's what the training is for, and I know that's what you put the time and the blood and the sweat and the tears into, but at the same time, you're only human, and you're allowed to make mistakes, and you're allowed to not be at your 100% best sometimes. And I think that that's something that would have really helped me during that period of my life, especially being a young child athlete, is this, this idea, this concept of it's okay to mess up. It's okay to not be perfect. And that perfection was something that I really struggled with for a while, but I feel like I've been able to let that go now, and I hope that you can do the same, and I hope that that resonates with you. Recently, there have been a couple of athletes who have started to bring about this conversation and kind of change the conversation around mental health in sports. And Michael Phelps has definitely done this in the swimming community, talking about his depression. He even had some suicidal thoughts, and he's at the elite Olympic level performance. I know that Simone Biles recently dropped out of the 2021 Tokyo Olympics because of some struggles with mental health, and was very open about that. And as someone who was an athlete and as someone who is currently in the field and is a mental health therapist, I just love their stories. I love how honest and open they are. Vulnerability is a strength to me, and I think it's so important for all of us to continue to speak up about what we've struggled with, because sports can be a very isolating experience for some people. I just found that their stories and their ability to talk about what they were going through is just a really great reminder that even the greatest athletes need rest and support, and I hope that you can offer that to yourself as well. As someone who has experienced this and mental health struggles as an athlete, I just kind of wanted to share some mental health tips for athletes. One, I would just share that, watch how you speak to yourself. That was a really big one that I was talking about earlier. We do have those high standards for ourselves, and that's perfectly fine. You're allowed to have, goals and those kinds of certain things that you want to achieve, but just watch how you talk to yourself about it. Give yourself a little bit more grace. Again, you are human, and, I like the saying that you're a human being, not a human doing, and it's okay to be human. Another mental health tip that I'd like to share is learning how to rest without guilt. I know that the sport community can make you feel like it's terrible to take a day off, and I completely resonate with that. I remember many missed events in my life because I was training, and that's perfectly fine. Again, those goals are important, especially in sports, and if it's what you're passionate about, definitely do it. But you're allowed to rest, and recovery is certainly essential, and I know that that's sometimes blocked into a training schedule, but at the same time, doing that without feeling guilty and not feeling like, you're setting yourself back a little bit, because you're allowed to rest. Again, you are human, and mental breaks are just as important as physical ones, so keep that in mind. Another mental health tip would be discover who you are beyond the sport. So obviously put the time, put the work into the sport if that's what you're passionate about, but there's more to you. I know there's more to you than just that sport. So maybe exploring those other interests that you have, maybe thinking about do I like music? Do I like art? Do I like school? Whatever that may be for you, or maybe spending more time with friends. And I know that can be hard with training and stuff, and there's a jam-packed schedule with, games or meets or things like that. But I really encourage you to really delve into your identity beyond being an athlete, because when or if you do leave the sport, it can be really hard to go on that identity journey. So definitely fanning that flame and being on top of that during that time while you're in the sport is really important. And I know that there are more aspects to you that are just as amazing than just the sport. And then the last little mental health tip, I'm sure it's a little bit obvious, but please reach out for help. There are many trained sports psychologists out there and therapists who deeply care about you and who you are and what you're struggling with. And definitely reach out to your teammates, to your coaches, and to therapists in your community if you're struggling with any mental health. The last little thing I want to say to you, if you are a current athlete, is that you are more than your performance, and you deserve rest and joy and support. I really enjoyed this topic today, and please leave any comments down below if any of this resonated with you, and keep on reflecting.